Hello, and welcome back to The Canadians. I'm your host, Jared Michael. Here at The Canadians, we attempt to understand Canada's contrarians. We believe contrarians are sometimes the only people holding valuable information the rest of society desperately needs. My guest today is Jimi Fritz. Jimi is a writer, musician, filmmaker, entrepreneur, and the author of several books, including Rave Culture. A longtime traveler and legendary party promoter, he has spent decades documenting and participating in one of the most influential and perhaps most misunderstood youth movements of the late 20th century. Although rave culture emerged as a global phenomenon throughout the 1980s and 90s, it largely disappeared from our broader cultural conversation. Millions of people participated in it, yet today it rarely receives the same attention as movements like the Roaring Twenties or the counterculture of the 60s. I wanted to explore why. We begin by defining what a rave actually is before tracing the origins of the movement, the music that shaped it, and the unique experience that kept people coming back. We discuss the sense of community, belonging, and tribal identity that emerged on dance floors around the world, and why so many people felt they had discovered something profoundly meaningful. From there, our conversation turns to psychedelics, the role of drugs within rave culture, why the movement was so often misunderstood by authorities and the media, and the ways some participants came to describe the experience in spiritual or even religious terms. Finally, we reflect on where rave culture stands today, what became of the movement, and what it might still have to teach us about community, ritual, music, and the search for human transcendence. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jimi Fritz. Jimi Fritz, welcome to the Canadians.
Welcome. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, your book, Rave Culture, it has sat on my bookshelf for over a quarter of a century now at this point,
Yes.
and so, I picked it up the other day and, we have the virtue of hindsight now. And you in the book, you kind of claim to be covering a true cultural revolution, or at least a phenomenon that, started in the 80s into the 90s. And I thought we could revisit that because it hasn't really been a lot of formal investigation or look back at that movement outside in the mainstream. And so, yeah, I thought we could start. And I thought maybe at the beginning here, because I still run into people who tell me they went to this great rave down on the Vegas Strip where they went in and heard this great music and everybody was drunk on 3-foot margaritas. And I'm like, it doesn't quite sound like the raving I
No,
was doing. So maybe at the
not quite.
beginning here for the non-ravers out there and all of us, maybe for the purpose of your book, how did you define a rave?
Well, it's a set of circumstances that came together serendipitously through the free party movement in England. There was a movement in England where people were setting up sound systems in fields and then inviting people by telephones or whatever, and they'd come in, and these were free concerts, usually with sort of psychedelic rock music and stuff. That whole scene that had already sort of been established, married with the club scene and house music, which started in Ibiza and then migrated north. Paul Oakenfold opened the first house music club in London, and that music fused with the free party scene. So now you've got these free parties, hit and run parties, underground parties, and then MDMA was the other ingredient. And once that meshed with the music and the scene, the free party scene, that came together and was the rave scene, which began in England and was called the Summer of Love in '87. And that was the beginning. And then it took off from there and migrated all around the world.
And so how would you differentiate between all these different venues playing EDM music? How would you distinguish between, is there a distinction between an alcohol fueled event and a more
Oh
MDMA
yeah,
fueled event?
MDMA was absolutely key. It creates a group mind experience, and that's what the rave experience is. It's a set of circumstances that come about through the music, which was all progressive house and trance music at the time. And that's a key ingredient because it creates this musical journey with these peaks and valleys and crescendos, and it lifts your emotions. And when you've got hundreds of people there and they're all on MDMA, which is like amplifying and supercharging their sense of empathy and connection, you get this incredible group mind experience, this group meditation. And that's what we call the rave experience. And that's unique because everybody's there with one intention in mind. They're only doing MDMA. There's no alcohol. There's no other sketchy drugs. They're not on crack or speed or whatever. And it just creates this unique, unifying experience, which comes together to form the rave experience. And that's what was so unique about it. And when I first discovered it, I mean, I was 40 years old when I went to my first rave and did my first MDMA. And it was life-changing. It was absolutely, I couldn't believe it. So that's why I saw it as a really important cultural and musical movement. And that's what inspired me to write the book, Rave Culture by Jimi Fritz.
And so
You're going to find bookstores everywhere.
you do cover your first experience in that book, and you know you're old enough that you kind of lived through the '60s revolution,
That's
and
right.
then this revolution as well. And you know you kind of speak about being a little cynical about the whole electronic scene, like you know you're playing bamboo flutes and wooden guitars, and just had no time for electronic music, it sounds like, until your first experience changed all that. Do you want to briefly just walk through what, you know, walk through your personal account of what that rave experience feels like to someone?
Yeah, I never actually listened to too much electronic. I mean, I'd heard all the electronic music experiments with synthesizers and sequencing and stuff like that, but I'd never really heard progressive house or trance music, which is what was, played at all the early raves. And so it was a surprise to me. And I went, I hooked up with a friend of mine's son who was 21 years old. And he said, yeah, there's this new thing. He came to visit me in Canada. There's a new thing called rave and blah, blah, blah. And you should check it out. It's new, and MDMA is a new drug and this and that. So I said, okay, I'll check it out. So I took my first hit of it and went down to the Salvation Army in Victoria and walked in. And I mean, the atmosphere was electric. And then the music started just pulsing and pulsing and pulsing. And then it came up on MDMA, and it just had this incredible transcendental experience of just being one with everybody, just being connected, being in the moment. It was like the most powerful. I've done quite a bit of meditation in the past. I've traveled all over India and done meditation in various places at various times. But this was unique. This was the most powerful meditation I'd ever done, because I was really, truly in the now, in the moment, in that second. Nothing else was happening, and it was so fulfilling and liberating. And I danced for like 7 hours. I hadn't danced in 25 years to music because I hadn't really found any music worth dancing to. But this stuff, really got to me. It was vibrating through my whole body. I was right up the front with the big sound system, and it was an amazing experience. And I walked out in the morning, and the sun came up, and I was just, I was transformed. I was a changed person from that point on. And then from then on, I went to lots of raves. And then I started my own underground rave cult and did parties every month for about 3 years. And thought it was such an important movement, and that it was really very underground at the time. Like, not many people had even, heard it. It wasn't in the mainstream press at all. And so I thought it was so important that I wanted to tell people about it and spread the words. I wrote Rave Culture, an Insider's Overview.
Oh. And what do you think the mainstream, what do you think they get wrong most often about this? How do they misunderstand this scene?
Well, they don't understand psychedelic drugs. That's the biggest problem. Neither do the police. They don't know the difference between MDMA and a flap of crack.
All right.
They think it's the same thing. It's not the same thing at all. And that's one of the main things that they miss. And so they see a bunch of people high dancing to music, and they think it's just frivolous nonsense. It's not frivolous nonsense. It's really important social cohesion, cultural, musical revolution. And that's what they miss.
Well, that's what I like about your framing of it is you put it squarely in that place of an organic ritual for our culture to come together. So do you see a similarity? Like if you look through history, I just see endless cultures that have nothing to do with each other that come up with very similar acts of, trance-like music, often taking a substance. The community comes together and they might dance through the night. Do you see that connection there?
It's not a new concept. It just came together at the rave scene in this turbocharged, energized, supercharged version. But yeah, you could go right back to the Elysian mysteries in Greece. 2,000 years before Christ, they were doing raves, essentially ritualistic gatherings with a drug called Kykenon, which is likely psychedelic, and people would come together and have these ritualistic group experiences, and it's kind of, social bonding. cultural bonding. It just brings people together and to transcend their ordinary life and to hook into something bigger and more immediate, in the moment, to learn how to just be in the moment for a while. So I think it's always had that value. And you look around at all the tribal traditions where people would dance all night, around the campfire and with a monotonous beat. That was the same kind of thing. So we've seen it. I mean, I draw parallels in the book with these cultural musical revolutions that happen every 30 years. And we had the Roaring Twenties, which was a dance movement, late night parties all night. They were fueled by opium and marijuana. Now we've got then we had the 60s, which was also a musical revolution, new music, new sounds, new ideas, charged through this filter of psychedelics, LSD, marijuana, mostly in the 60s. And then the turbocharged 80s with rave culture. So it's a very similar thing that repeats itself. It was just a particularly intense form.
And it involves this direct experience you're talking about. And it sounds like, do you want to explain the values that kind of got expressed that came out of that direct experience, like with a plur that is spoken about?
Yeah. Well, it was mind blowing actually, because like I say, I did raves myself, promoted for about 3 years, and I see people come into the parties, and they were from all walks of life. There was kind of computer nerds, and there were kind of outsiders. There were introverts. There were metal guys. There were different people from different walks of life, but mostly people that had been kind of isolated by culture in some ways. They were it's like backwaters. And this was the first time, and you could see them transformed. I mean, I said, we were in the business of exploding love bombs, and you'd see it go off, when the E kicked in and everybody was dancing. You'd see them looking around in wonder, because for the first time in their lives, some of these people, they were actually genuinely connected empathetically to a group of people around them. And some of them have never even had that from their families. And now they were getting it in this group situation where everybody was on the same page and everybody was just looking at each other thinking, oh my God, what's happening? It was totally new, and it was totally transformative. I saw many, many, many people's lives transformed by the rave experience.
Yeah, you talked to hundreds of people in your interviews in that book. And so can you describe or articulate in any way the way it does affect individual? Like how does, after that party's over and they go home, how does it change their day-to-day life?
Well, it's like the psychedelic experience in general. Once you've had it, then you understand more about how your mind works and how your body works. It's like it's an awareness amplifier. So in that type of situation, with the drug, with the music, with the atmosphere, with the people, you get this transcendental experience, and that's the value of meditation. You learn that you can transcend your own mind, and with the rave experience, you learn the same thing basically, that you can actually transcend your mundane life and connect on a higher level, or a bigger level, or a wider level, or whatever, more intense level with other people. And that's revelatory for a lot of people, because, like I said, most people are very isolated. They go to work, they sit in their cars to go to work, they sit in the office, they watch TV, they go to bed. They're not really getting meaningful relationships. And even people that do have social things, they're very kind of superficial or cursory. They have relationships, but they're not really connecting. And that's a real loss. I think that's why people are so anxious and depressed, and why we're all going mad, because we don't have that meaningful human connection. And any psychologist will tell you that the most important thing for mental health is meaningful human connections, meaningful relationships, being able to relate to somebody honestly and authentically. And a lot of people don't have that in their lives. And, the rave scene provided that for a lot of people for a long time.
Yeah, it feels like one of the quintessential rave experiences is, just sharing space with a person next to you that you don't share any words with or talk to. And then at some point you just end up embracing, because of this love you can feel for each other. It's just in the air, this, like you say, this group experience of empathy.
Yeah.
It just, Yeah, would you like to, there's the plur, peace, love, unity, and respect. Would you want to speak about those values that kind of came out of that experience?
Yeah, that came from a DJ in New York called Frankie Bones, and when the rave scene hit New York, they had this underground house scene. That's where the word house came from, because houses of the gay houses, and then that became, and the house was also from warehouse. So it was house. It was invented by mostly by gay DJs on MDMA, and Frankie Bones was doing a party in a warehouse in New York, and there was some aggro there, some fights broke out or whatever. And he turned up the lights and he stopped and he said, "Listen, people, this is about peace, love, unity, and respect." And he made this, now famous speech, and that stuck. So that became the credo, the ethos of the rave culture. It was peace, love, unity, and respect, and PLUR was the acronym. So that was on every flyer for every party for about 20 years. And you'd always see this PLUR, peace, love, unity, and respect. So nothing wrong with that, right?
I don't know. And even when the book comes out like 25 years ago, you're making the argument that even then they're saying that there's probably more ravers in the world than there were hippies ever. And so here we are 25 years later. Like, what impact do you think this cultural movement has had on our culture as it's unfolded over decades now, with this many people having had this experience and going out into the world and sharing, putting it out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's on balance, it's got to have a positive experience, just as the people that came out of the 60s changed the culture, they changed the music, they changed art, they changed politics. And so I think the same thing came out of the rave scene. It's just another iteration of the same type of cultural movements that have been throughout history. And I think they do carry forward. They don't completely transform the world. Everybody doesn't become a raver, but it plays a part in changing the overall ethos of the society. It seeps in here and there in unexpected ways. It changed a lot about advertising and business and fashion, music. All these things are affected, and some of those things continue. Some of them phase out. Some of them continue in other forms. But it's all part of the evolution of culture.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I guess, uh, you also make the claim of it a bit of as a religion. How do you see that 25 years later?
Well, I mean, you can draw comparisons with religion, but I wouldn't say it was a religion. Um, I'd say there's definitely an aspect of group group mind devotion, if you like. So with the DJ at the head of the room at the decks, and the DJ was the high priest, and everybody stood in front and in awe of the music and the atmosphere. I mean, the first raves I went to were at the Salvation Army, and they was in the chapel. So the chapel is this beautiful building. It was slated for demolition. So some local groups went in there and they did parties there like every week for months, and each time it got more and more transformed. But the main room was the church basically. So there was a pulpit at the front where the DJs were, and there were stained glass windows all around the room. And the sun would come up in the morning, and the light would burst through the stained glass windows, and shafts of light. It was quite moving. And obviously it makes you think of that religious experience. But those types of experiences, or transcendental, transpersonal journeys, are not limited to religious belief or spiritual belief. They're inherent qualities of human beings, which can be achieved in a variety of ways. You don't have to believe things that aren't true, which is what religion requires.
Right, right. And so, the hippie movement is just so famous in our culture, and it's recognized for having such a cultural influence, where it doesn't really feel like, outside of ravers, the mainstream really understands like, do you feel like, I don't feel like the rave scene is seen by outsiders the same as the hippie movement, and maybe I feel like it's all a bit of a double-edged. Part of the reason I think that might be is because ravers and raving largely I'd argue, transcended politics. Whereas maybe the hippie movement kind of was more embedded in politics. And so it felt like it was more connected to the obvious change. But I also feel like maybe that's why the hippie movement sputtered out, was because it was linked to politics, where I feel like the ravers managed to transcend politics. And I wonder if that helped it endure.
Yeah, I think the hippie movement became political. There were lots of political branches of it, and that happened a little bit in rave culture. There was the right to dance movement, and they were lobbying governments, And I mean, I was part of a group of people that lobbied City Hall to change the laws around late night parties, and we rescinded the 2 a.m. bylaw, and we got a designation for raves, non-alcoholic all night parties, and a license for venues too. So, there was some political movement and stuff and posturing. I think one of the differences is that the hippie scene of the '60s, it kind of fizzled out and society carried on without it, sort of. But the rave movement was it continued, and it continues today, but in a completely different form. The actual original sort of rave experience and the group mind transcendental experience doesn't really happen anymore, because the music changed so drastically. The music split off into a number of different directions. So you've got a lot of hip hop influences with the breakbeat forms, with jungle and drum and bass, dubstep, and all that. And then you had this other mood. So you got the house movement and the techno movement. And everything split off into these different genres and basically went into the clubs. And so now it's kind of a very selective, diverse music scene that's in the clubs. And it's not the same music, and it's not the same drugs. So, there's a lot more cocaine going on. There's a lot more speed going on. So it's not the same. It doesn't create that cohesive vibe. The music doesn't glue people together, and the drugs don't glue people together. So it did kind of it fizzled out in a way, in a dissipated way, because it just fractured into all these different elements.
Okay, so yeah, I see like these big EDM festivals. I think Shambhala is still going on and stuff like that.
Yeah,
But there's no, you go city to city to city, and there's not underground warehouse parties or kind of
yeah.
these that's not happening much anymore.
There's a few. I mean, there's a few around in Victoria and Vancouver still, but they're smaller events. They're usually about 100, 200 people, and they're one hit parties. And they're mostly kind of house parties or techno parties. There's very little progressive house or trance anymore, and that to me was an essential element of all the early raves. Was that the music created this musical journey, this drumbeat that you just tuned into, and it just took you, and it was built. I mean, the music was written by, DJs that did MDMA. And you can hear that in the music. It builds and builds and builds. And then there's a crescendo and a plateau. And then it builds and builds and builds again. It does that all the way through the night till 7 o'clock in the morning. So it creates that atmosphere. Whereas now, you go to a club and you'll get 3 DJs, and one guy will be playing breakbeat, and then you'll get some techno, and then you'll get some tech house or something. And it doesn't unify the journey anymore.
So do you think it was just a perfect storm, like the right thing at the right time, and all the ingredients were right, and it's just we're in a different place and a different time now?
Yeah, I think everything is like that. I think the entire history is like that. It's a bunch of serendipitous events which come together in a random way and then cause an effect, and then it explodes, and then it fizzles away. I mean, that's the history of the world. That's the history of culture and music. It all comes and goes. It all evolves.
It seems like politically, it feels like everybody's talking about the world just being in flux right now. But you're kind of talking about musical driven revolutions as well in the 20s, 60s, 90s. We're kind of overdue now. Do you
Yeah.
see anything happening? Do you see another musical revolution on the?
No, but I'm ready to go, I mean, yeah, I don't see another scene happening right now. It might be a nascent scene in New York or somewhere, or Chicago, which is just beginning, which is about to explode on the world. But yeah, we need some new music and we need some new drugs.
Yeah.
Maybe that will cause the next scene. I mean, there will be a next scene. There always has been, right? There's always been a new scene and a new direction and new experiences. So I don't see any reason why that would stop all of a sudden.
And could these things decouple? Could like the psychedelic experience of the rave scene start popping up somewhere else organically while we have a musical revolution that drives us in different directions?
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely. And I think that's what's happening. The music has gone in a completely different direction. And psychedelics now have become incredibly popular and legalized in many, many places for many, for research. And in some places, legalized mushrooms. And so there's a whole psychedelic drug revolution going on right now, whereas they're actually being tested. I mean, because they've been illegal, right? You can't do any real research on illegal drugs. So now there's exemptions, there's licenses, there's various groups all around the world. There's four or five major universities in the States now that have departments of psychedelic medicine.
uh,
So psychedelics are being taken very seriously right now, and there's a real revolution in their use, and to figure out what they're good for and what they're not good for, because they're not good for everything. It's not like you take a hit of acid and all your problems go away. Usually they're coupling them with therapy. And one of the difficulties in the research is it's very difficult to separate out the effect of the therapy from the effect of the drug, right?
right.
Because MDMA therapy, for instance, has been massively successful in treating PTSD. But they did the studies and they were very, very close. MAPS has been doing this, a multidisciplinary society for psychedelic studies. And they've been pushing forward MDMA research for 30 years now. And they came very, very close recently. And they were just about to get approved, but the last studies, they couldn't separate out the effects. They had great results, but they were, it's in conjunction with therapies. So it's very hard to say what the drug, I mean, the drug really just puts you in a super receptive place so that the therapy is much more effective, right? But you still need the therapy. You can't just do it and cure your PTSD.
Isn't that how it didn't in the early days of MDMA? It have some origins with therapists when it was still legal.
Yeah, that's right. Alexander Shulgin was there was this chemist in California that was a Dow Jones, Dow Chemicals guy, and he had invented a couple of things for them, and they gave him a research grant, and they said, research anything you want. And he was fascinated with benzene rings. So he started looking at psychedelics, mescaline and mushrooms and whatnot, and he came across an old patent, MDMA, from 1914, from the Merck Corporation. And it surfaced once again in the 50s, where the US Army were using it as a potential sort of mind control drug, and they think everything's a mind control drug for some reason. And they're actually mind freeing drugs. So it's, they didn't have much luck with it and they shelved it. And then Shulgin reintroduced it, and he did it with his wife, who was a therapist. And then he started giving it to his therapist friends. And there was a huge network across the States of underground therapists, and they were using it in relationship counseling and anxiety, depression, PTSD, all these different things. They were having fantastic results. And so it was growing and growing in popularity. And then it burst out on the dance scene in Dallas, Texas, in the clubs. And then from then on, it became, a public menace, according to the authorities. So they didn't know what it was or what it was going to do or what ramifications of millions of people doing this drug were. So they just scheduled it. It was a Schedule I drug, which is a temporary measure. It stayed in that status until today. And so it was used extensively and then because it became illegal, and the therapists went underground, and there were people making huge amounts of it, and it was all going to the therapists. But when it hit the dance scene, then everything changed, because it was now kind of discredited and people didn't want to be associated with the illegal activity and whatnot. So it kind of phased out. I think there's still many underground psychedelic therapists. I mean, I know a bunch of those. When they're doing therapy with mushrooms and some ketamine, MDMA, but they do it underground and they risk their livelihood, so we're not there yet, but we're getting very close to having a lot of these substances, researched properly and figuring out what they can do and what they can't do. And we'll definitely see that in the future. We saw it with marijuana, right? I mean, marijuana was illegal for 60 years, and then now it's legal. Now you can go to the corner store and buy it.
Yeah. Well,
So,
what do you think of the way we are approaching this? Could you see a world where everyday citizens have access to these psychedelics?
oh yeah, absolutely.
And how do you see that unfolding? Is it just like a dispensary, just walk in and get them, or is it more prescription based or vetted in some way?
Well,
Or
it'll happen the same way as it happened with marijuana, I think. First of all, there'll be medical use. First of all, they'll say MDMA will get licensed for PTSD, and that will mean that it'll be available in a legal, in a good source, like made by a pharmaceutical company. It will be perfect tea. It will be beautifully made. It will be, totally safe. And that will get onto the underground. And then people will start using it, or people will start selling it under the auspices of medical MDMA, just like they did cannabis. I mean, there were loads of cannabis stores well before it was legal. They did the same thing in mushrooms with Colorado. They're doing the same things here with mushrooms. There's stores that are just openly selling mushrooms and cactus, peyote. They're just selling them. And they're saying, oh, these people need their medicine. Right, so they create this kind of gray area around this is medical MDMA. So okay. So that goes on for a while, and then there's more and more exemptions, and then there's a few court cases, and then a few people get busted, and then it makes the news, and then it changes the popular view, and then eventually it becomes legal. That's the route that cannabis took. That's the route that's happening with mushrooms right now, and I'm sure it will happen with most other psychedelics eventually.
yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty happy. Like, it's silly that people were sitting in jail over marijuana, but overall, I'm not exactly thrilled with the way it's been unrolled in Canada. It feels like I had Ted Smith of the medical dispensary on the
Yeah,
show, and he's not very happy. It seems like we've forgotten all about the medical patients now, and they can't even access their medical marijuana very well. And I'm paying exorbitant rates to multinational companies now for my, if I want to go through a dispensary to buy my
yeah, it's been
marijuana.
kind of corporized. It was a fantastic business before legalization. I mean, I'm also glad that people aren't getting busted and spending time in jail.
Yeah, that makes
That
sense,
was a major, major drag.
It just would have been nice if they would have allowed the people who've been producing it for generations to
Yeah,
continue to produce it, and we could have
yeah,
had economies going into small communities. It's so
that's
difficult to
right.
get economies out of the big cities, and we already had it done, and then we just handed it over to a few multinationals, which
Yeah,
anyways, that's a
yeah, it was an unfortunate circumstance that they should have grandfathered in the people that had been growing and also developing these strains, which, over the last 50 years, people have been breeding and experimenting like experts. They all got thrown out. They all got thrown under the bus. And then you had the government trying to grow it, and they had zero experience.
yeah.
So I think they're doing better now. But yeah, it was a rough transition.
And so, going back to the rave scene there, I can remember, I was in that rave scene, and you could sit down. I remember one particular moment I sat down and had a conversation with a young kid who was like 20, and he was making his money as a squeegee kid back in the day when they'd run up to your car at the intersection and then wipe
Right.
your clean your windshield and ask for some change. And he got up, and a retired university professor sat down and took his place. And that kind of reflected the diversity of people that were attending these events. And was that like, who were all the different people you encountered over your years of going to who are the ravers?
It was interesting because they did come from a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of creative people. So there was a lot of like artists, musicians, writers, people that were just curious about life and, experimenters. And so they were there. There was also a big tech crowd, people that spend all their time sitting in front of a computer screen, and they were kind of isolated from the world, but they saw it through the lens of the computer from a distance, from a safe distance, because they didn't feel necessarily comfortable in crowds of people. And some of those people, it was the most striking, because you could see that they'd been isolated for so long, and then all of a sudden they had this incredible connection, and it changed their lives. We used to call it their lives changed by the Church of Rave.
Yeah, yeah, that's that experience. And you kind of said that you're not a big fan of religion, but there's a lot of tension there when you get into the scene, because a lot of people will talk about having religious-like experiences.
Well,
Like,
they are religious-like experiences.
beyond even just, it sounds like, connecting with people empathetically, you're going to hear people making claims that, go further than that, connecting to, higher powers, connecting to consciousness, merging with the, kind of that classic near death or mystical experience.
Yeah.
You'll hear, where do you sit on those kind of descriptions?
Well, it's easy to see, how people come, because up until, really the last 50 years, I guess, or even less, most of those awe-inspiring transcendental type experiences were interpreted in religious terms, because the church had a monopoly on that type of experience, but I don't think they do anymore. I think, rave scene certainly proved that, because most people that went to raves were not religious. But they had these transcendental experiences. Like, you can do the same in meditation and various other practices, where you transcend your ordinary mundane life. You transcend your ego, the dissolution of the ego. These are all experiences which are common to meditation and yoga and other, practices, psychedelic therapy, for instance. None of which require the belief in a goat herder, son of God. In the Middle Ages, you don't need the Stone Age philosophy. You don't need the belief in myths, things that are demonstrably not true. You don't need to go there. You don't need the trappings of religion to have awe-inspiring, transcendental experiences.
But if someone made the statement something like, "I think consciousness preceded material reality," that's not necessarily falling back on a religious myth or story, but it's making a religious-like claim.
Well, no, that's a different question. That's a question of psychology and neuroscience, like whether consciousness is an emergent property of the brain, or whether consciousness is like in the ether and is, we receive it. I don't think there's any evidence for that. I mean, I'm open to that idea in the future. I don't have a firm view on it, but I mean, it seems to me that when I listen to neuroscientists and when I listen to consciousness researchers, which I do a lot, the scientific consensus is that there's no evidence for consciousness outside of the brain.
Right, yeah.
And we know that, the brain is producing consciousness, because when we poke bits, we lose abilities. So we know that there's a direct correlation with the architecture of the brain and the neurons firing. When the neurons stop firing, there's no more thought. When the brain dies, consciousness dies, and there's never been any real evidence to suggest that that's not true. Maybe there will be in the future. Maybe we'll discover new things about it, like we do about everything. But as for now, I think that, the correct position to take is that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain, until such time as we learn more about that.
Yeah, it feels like there's nothing objective in objective science that can elevate that claim to like public knowledge. But there's a lot of people who carry it around as a personal belief due to the subjective experience they've had.
Yeah, right. That's the lowest form of evidence you can possibly have for anything.
Well, it's the lowest form of evidence to other people. When you're trying to prove it to a collective, but to an individual, they might not care so much. I think this is why religious people can trump science 7 days a week, because to them, it's about their personal conviction. They don't need to prove it to you. And so their subjective experience is enough to prove it to themselves, and that's all they care about.
So if I have a personal belief that I'm the reincarnation of Napoleon, then that's my personal truth. So that's just as valid. I can't prove it to you.
Yeah. This is why we keep it firmly in the personal belief column and not the public knowledge column.
Yeah, but I mean, you can believe any type of nonsense. You can believe all kinds of things that aren't true. You can be delusional. That doesn't mean that there's a real truth there or reality there.
Yeah, I agree with you, because I am a big fan of like the Steven Pinker and the Sam Harrises of the world as well.
Yeah.
But I often feel like there's I do feel that there's maybe, there's a distinction, I feel like, between why should we expect knowledge about the universe to fit into a method that we can turn into public knowledge? What if there is knowledge that is only obtainable on an individual level?
Well, then that's not collective knowledge, and it's not collective truth, and it's not the way the world works. It's just the way one person's mind works.
Yeah, I feel like it's because we have a history of madmen and delusional people making all sorts of crazy claims, but I feel like it's inconveniently, there could still be a reality where there are truths about the universe that are only obtainable by an individual and can't be elevated to a public knowledge level
Well, then it doesn't seem to be very useful then.
on
If
an
it's
on a collective level.
if it's only relative to an individual, yeah, well, you can believe in an afterlife, and that's a nice consoling fantasy. You can believe that you're in connection with, beings on the other side of the Pleiades. You can believe all of those things,
But,
but that doesn't mean that they're true.
but then you could take a look at someone like Wim Hof, Wim Hof, the
Yeah.
Iceman.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so he made all these claims that he could do things like, let's pump him full of inject him with influenza, and he wouldn't get sick when 99.9% of the population would. And they're like, "Oh, you're a genetic freak." And he's like, "Well, I'll train other people." So, Harvard has studied him, and he trained 12 other people, and they could do it all of a sudden after him. And so now they recognize this, like you say, maybe science will catch up and we can find ways to turn this into
Well, I
objective
think
facts. But that what his personal truth turned out to be real.
well, it's
We just
true.
we just
It
had to
might
prove
be
it.
it might just be true that cold baths and good. I mean, breathing is not a new thing. The breathing, Wim Hof breathing, is the breath of fire from yoga from 4,000 years ago.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not a new thing.
yeah.
Jumping into ice baths, the Swedes have been doing that for hundreds of years, to boost their immune system. That's not new. So there's nothing new there. And the things that he's doing are actually known to science to, boost your immune system. It's not going to make you immune to everything, but it might boost your immune system if you just keep doing it and keep doing it. It shocks the system, right? The system goes into a kind of a shock, and it goes into a hypervigilant area, and it can protect you from, minor infections or viruses or whatever. But it's not a cure-all. It's not a way to fight a pandemic, for instance.
Yeah, no, I agree. And yeah, and I just find it fascinating, that he did have like, another place. I just think that I think there is a danger in elevating personal truths to public knowledge because madmen just go crazy. And so we have to make that distinction that, you have to be able to prove something objectively for us to talk about it like knowledge. But
Right.
I do worry while saying that we might be losing something in totally disregarding subjectivity. We put it away at the very beginning of the scientific method. We get rid of subjectivity. And I think maybe there is, like the big five personality traits in psychology. They got teased out of subjectivity. It took decades and decades and decades, but now
Yeah.
there's a lot of consensus around them and they're seen as useful tools and they came out of the subjective experience.
Well, check with the psychologists, because the latest scientific consensus is that those things are not useful.
The big five
Or
personality traits?
yeah,
Oh,
yeah, and
really?
all these personality types where you put them together in a diagram and stuff, that they're not really that useful.
Oh, I thought there was a lot of consensus around the big five personality
I think you'll
traits.
find the opposite if
Oh,
you
really?
look at it.
I'll
Yeah.
take a look at that. Yeah.
But I mean, science doesn't explain everything. It's not about, it explains how the world works. It
Mm-hmm.
explains how brains work, but it doesn't explain everything. And so what you're talking about is this expression of personal reality, that we have art for that. We have music, we have art, painting. We have all these expressions of art. And I think that's the personal expression of subjective states.
I was thinking more about the personal experience of
Yeah.
reality, not
Well,
necessarily expression.
the art reflects the personal experience, because we all do have a unique personal experience. And if you express yourself through an artistic form from your own personal experience and authentic position, and you do it in an authentic and direct way, you will create good art. That's how good art is created.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just find it, I'm just, like, this is an area I would love to talk to as much as they'd hate to have this conversation, as Steven Pinker or Sam Harris.
Yeah.
It's like, it's still something I come back on because I'm totally with them on the importance of objective knowledge. But I do worry that there's it's only recently in the last century and a half that we can actually look at the entire world, different cultures, different myths, different stories. And you do see, like, they could have been separate experiences happening in Indonesia, from Mongolia, from South America. But we see the religious experience, the mystical experience, the near death experience. it rings true across all of these places, through all of history, through all the time. There's people making these claims, but they're embedded in a subjective experience. And so I can see how you could say, well, it's a human body. It's the same wherever it is in time, and it generates this experience, but it's lodged, like you say, in the brain. But I can't help but be open and be willing to investigate just the consistency of through history and time of these claims makes me want to take them a bit more seriously than just dismissing them.
I think the commonality of experience you're talking about, whether you look in different cultures and they come up with the same kind of solutions. So it was because, we didn't have scientific explanations. We didn't have explanations of how the sun came up in the morning or went down at night. So we made up stories and myths. And it's not surprising that lots of cultures invented a sun god. Some people would say even Christianity did that. The Son of God was the God's son or whatever. You can play with that idea, but it's not surprising to me that people would come up with mythical versions of how the world worked because they didn't have good explanations. Now we do, and like a lot of those myths now can be dismissed because we have much better explanations of why the sun comes up and down in the morning, right? So
It's not so much the myths and the stories I'm talking about as I'm talking about the direct experience. Like someone gets maimed by a wolf or falls off a cliff and is died and then gets rescued by their villagers and brought back to life. And they claim to have had this mystical experience in that moment. It's that specific mystical, religious, near-death experience I'm talking about, not the myth-making or the religious
transcendental
storytelling.
experience,
The transcendental experience.
which brings us back to rave culture because that's what it was all about. And that's what a lot of movements are about, and that's what a lot of so-called spiritual practices are about. They're about transcendental experiences, experiencing the world in a different way. But I don't think you need the myths. I don't think you need to believe anything that's not true. I think you can have a transcendental experience every bit as powerful as the guy getting bitten by the wolf.
Yeah. Well, you go through, why do we need these things?
Because it's part of the human experience. The human experience involves like looking outside of ourselves and trying to, experience the world in new ways. And that's, that gives us the impetus to be fascinated by psychedelic drugs, because it gives us, we want to explore our own mind. We want to explore our own consciousness. And so the psychedelics and the rave culture and meditation and all these practices are from the same basic fundamental human urge to explore.
And so, yeah, you can see the levels of people went to, the effort of going into empty warehouses, printing out flyers, finding DJs, organizing all these things,
That's
setting
right.
up lights. Like, it's a lot of work,
And they did that just for those few hours of that feeling, the feeling of freedom, basically. It's being free from your conditioning. Because most of us are so wrapped up in our conditioning that we never feel that freedom. And with the rave experience, people actually felt this massive dose of freedom for the first time in their lives sometimes. And that's a powerful experience. Can't underestimate that.
Yeah, no, it's very freeing. And it gives me a lot of hope that just, to see that even, the amount of effort people went through this, that this desire is going to come out no matter what the world throws at us, that humans are going to get together, be scrappy, and find ways of still connecting with these things and these experiences.
I can't wait to see what's next.
Yeah, I wonder what is next. It's like, 25 years later here, looking at that book, would you do anything differently now?
What, with the book?
Yeah.
I think the book is a kind of a historical document now. It was actually used in a few universities and colleges for, popular pop psychology courses and stuff. And I think it's more of a historical document now than when I wrote it, it was happening. It was an immediate thing. And there wasn't any other book like it. So there wasn't any other book that I call it a primer for the global rave phenomenon. Rave Culture, and Inside is Over Here by Jimi Fritz.
It's on my shelf in the background. You probably can't see it in your camera angle.
No.
It's on the wide angle. Yeah.
But yeah, and some of it's out of date now. I go into, events around the world. I did a consensus. I send out hundreds of emails to rave promoters and ravers from all around the world. about 16 different countries. So I got that perspective in. But, those things have changed now. So there's a list of websites in the back. I'm sure none of them exist anymore.
Right. Yeah. Really did the unity part really did come through for me. This whole podcast even wouldn't exist without the rave scene, I don't think. And
Right.
just, even that quintessential moment of just, hugging that person across from me for,
Yeah.
maybe a minute, not ever saying a word with them. And I don't remember asking them who they voted for in the last election or
Right.
what they thought of gender ideology before I hugged them. Like, we transcended those, and it really, it made me realize that my politics had to catch up to my raving. The raving was the truer instinct. The raver was the pure and the right way
Right.
to be approaching things. And the politics was just dividing.
Yeah.
And then this was just a direct experience of common humanity. It was
Yeah, it was a very, very authentic kind of almost primal connection that you had with other people that you didn't have anywhere else in your life. That's what struck people, that it was liberating in that way.
Yeah, and I was a caregiver at the time, and I brought the young 50-year-old gentleman who was a nonverbal, fully quadriplegic,
Right.
who just became embedded in the scene. They just took him in like nobody else. All his caregivers were hired from the community after that.
Right.
And and he just lived his best life for the next years
know.
after till he passed
Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know that. And
I know that.
yeah,
I know a few people that said a couple of people actually too.
yeah,
Richard.
and what I'll tell you this because he's passed away now, and and he told me that before he came to that scene, his dad had committed suicide when he was still at home.
Right.
His father, and he said he was spending his days planning how to kill himself, and
Yeah.
that's what he was doing before he found that scene, and
Right.
then that scene just changed his life. All of a sudden, people saw him for who he was, and he was accepted and welcomed, and he just didn't kill himself after that.
Right.
And
No, he had many years of wonderful human connection after that, which is very rare for a quadriplegic. I know he was cerebral palsy, right?
Yeah. So
Somebody in that state with that degree of disability, it's unheard of to have that type of quality in your life and that type of community connection. I mean, you'd have young girls sitting on his lap all night, it's over the moon.
and I just thought that was one of the more, you had all the visuals up and lights going off, and I just thought that was one of the most powerful visuals. It was just watching people interact with him and just treat him with so much respect and love and equality that it was just amazing.
Peace,
Well,
love,
James, that's
respect.
just wrapping up here. I'm curious. You're a bit of a Renaissance man. I know you're not just a rave promoter, and so where else can people find you and your thoughts and what you're up to in your creative works?
You can find me at jimifritz.ca. That's jimifritz.ca. I have 3 books: Confessions of an Ethical Drug Dealer, Jimi Fritz, and The End of Everything. This is the last book that I wrote. It's a novel about a character called Fritz, who's plotting his own suicide in a mental asylum. It's hilarious. It's a black comedy. It's kind of an homage to Russian literature, which I'm a big fan of. But yeah, the website has 35 videos of my original songs. There's 7 albums that you can download for free. There's lots of writings and photos and other stuff. So it's your one-stop shopping for your entertainment needs. jimifritz.ca.
All right. Yeah, the ethical drug dealer. It is kind of crazy that we're this far away from the 60s and we still just call drugs.
Well, that's there's a chapter in Rave Culture called Drugs. And that's, I make that point that, we say drugs this, drugs that. Or what are you talking? Are you talking about aspirin? Are you talking about an antibiotic? Or are you talking about crack? It's such a stupid word to use because it doesn't mean anything on its own. You have to qualify it. There's a huge difference between, one drug and another drug.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for everything, Jimmy.
Cheers.
Really appreciate it. And
all right.
Have a good rest of your day. We'll say goodbye to everybody now.
Cheers, Jared. Peace out.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the show, please visit our donations page or subscribe and share with friends. The Canadians. Working class roots, a free speech lens. Canadian Contrarians.